Okay, it is 1:30 on the dot, so I think we might as well keep moving at a reasonable speed and pace. We've been on time this whole day today, so well done everybody for keeping the time. So we've got our second panel of those of us who are here in DISC, who are going to be presenting and talking about our research and what's going on with what has to do with AI and the things that connect all of us and everything else, and obviously related finally to AI literacies, as Adi was saying earlier, critical AI literacies, right? Like going one step above just thinking in like crude educational terms, or thinking about like how can we go above and beyond and show a critical eye on these things. I hope everyone online can hear me. I think it seems like the system is working, but do let us know if you have any issues in the chat, if you're having struggle hearing anything that we're saying. But I'm pretty sure the camera's working and the microphone worked earlier as well. So I will get going. And as a result, that also means I go first. I'm on the list actually already as being the first person to go, but I will quickly share my screen here. It says, do I just go? Oh, yeah, here, this one. Yeah, perfect. And then I will that up and make that go away. And I think everyone can see what's on the screen right now. So thank you. So I will quickly introduce myself again. Adi said earlier, but I'm Daniel Joseph. I am the co-lead of DISC. So, and I'm really, really happy that we were able to pull this off today. We planned this so long ago. We figured out, again, our similarities in terms of like looking at AI across the whole research group. And then, we went to everybody, we said, let's do an event, and finally we're here. So it's really cool. And to everyone online, thank you for joining us. And to everyone in the room, all also, it's really great to have you here. So, yeah, is that working? No. Okay, not really sure. Okay, hi, that's me. That's my daughter, Romy, for her Foxy. So yeah, that's me. I'm a senior lecturer of digital sociology here in the soon-to-be renamed School of Criminology and Sociology. I study the internet, and I kind of, that's really important to me, as I've been researching lots of different digital things, like, we're in the digital research Digital Society Research Group. But I always kind of say like I'm a internet person. I study digital technologies that are networked, right? And with a kind of focus on things like platforms and the process of platformization. I've been working on platformization questions basically since I think like, since I did my dissertation for my PhD, where I researched this thing called Steam, which is like a video game distribution platform. And so almost all my research kind of comes back to these questions of, what platforms are and all this kind of stuff. And, I've written about digital storefronts, mobile app stores, video games, advertising, theorizing things like digital capitalism and all that. So that's kind of who I am. And the kind of theoretical angle, or the kind of conceptual angle that I take on all this, is from the perspective of critical political economy, which, we've got two definitions of it here. So one is, as Vincent Mosco, who's like a Canadian political economist who passed away just a few years ago, but, kind of like a titan in the field of researching communications. He said political economy was the study of the social relations, particularly the power relations, that mutually constitute production, distribution, and consumption of resources. So that's kind of like, it's very broad, right? Like, and also it kind of feels like it involves like the study of like almost everything, but I love that. For me, that means that like there's kind of nothing that's really entirely off limits when you're thinking about political economy. I also like the second definition here. Is like a general and ambitious definition would be the study of control and survival in social life. And so thinking about, who has control, who has power, who's able to survive well, who isn't, right? And this comes back to questions of inequality. So looking at AI, I'm really interested in applying political economy to especially the most recently emerged, world of LLMs. And so kind of like thinking about, those kinds of like connections. So like Eileen Meehan in 1993 was also thinking about political economy. And I think this is really, what I'm doing now in terms of like expanding my research into AI is like uncovering connections between ownership, corporate structure, finance capital, and market structures to show how economics affects technologies, politics, culture, and information. And so I'm really interested in like, we know that AI has been around for a long time. If anyone who's, been researching AI, before the launch of, the like GPTs and, transformer architecture in 2017, 2018, it's been around for a long time. But like, I think there's something, we know that there's been a step change. And I think, those of us who weren't necessarily focused on AI now have to kind of really grapple with the fact that it has like expanded precipitously into pretty much every aspect of social life. And right, so, we can think about what's happening at the level of politics of this country right now, right? You know, the current Labor government is kind of talking quite a lot about AI policy, going to make the country AI ready and all this kind of stuff. We know that AI, there's a lot of AI hype, and it's not clear necessarily what it's all going to do, but we do know it is shaping politics and social life, right? So, it's industrial policy is a big ticket question right now. I think Ting, she's not here, but obviously what she was researching is the AI race between the US and China. Education sector, we're going to be talking about that, for the rest of the day in different ways. Health sector, obviously, Sam was talking about work and labor conditions. How does AI change what people are doing at their jobs? What I research, how it changes cultural production, things like that. So that's why we need to be looking at power and control in AI. And a few things that I'm looking at that I'll kind of go through before I'm done, because I have about 2 minutes left, is looking at the way that AI is affecting the digital game industry. So there's questions around, baseline stuff is like, is AI going to take people's jobs? I think there's a broad consensus that probably not in the way that we think it's going to. More likely, it'll change roles. It'll change the productivity of certain kinds of positions. There's questions around obviously art. So like, will AI be used in cultural production, like video games, for instance, to create art assets? Some places are doing it. A lot of big studios are not because there's serious copyright implications. But I think the video game industry is really interested in AI from the perspective of AI agents, which is kind of, again, the next big step change with large language models that, Anthropic is relentlessly pursuing right now. So is OpenAI. Is just this idea of like, again, like creating AI powered agents. There's already been tests, creating entire game worlds and, creating AI powered characters and all this kind of stuff, right? So there's definitely a question of like what AI is going to do to game design. Another thing I'm working on is how AI summaries and search are changing media and journalism, the media industry generally, but also how it's changing the world of search engine optimization, which was a a quite important intermediary industry that was like connecting people that wanted to advertise and figuring out, having them basically getting paid to then, help them tailor their websites to be more discoverable. So I'm working on research with Dr. Sophie Bishop at the University of Leeds, looking at, how AI summaries that Google's rolled out is essentially robbing websites of web traffic, which coincidentally we're also running Google ads on them. So how it's changing the entire advertising ecosystem is really interesting. And also the industries that rely on advertising for their revenue. I've also, because I research the video game industry a lot, and I'm writing a book right now about platforms and platformization in the video game industry. I'm also starting a project on looking at the political economy of NVIDIA, which is one of, if not the main company that is manufacturing the high-power GPUs that OpenAI and other large language models rely on to do all of their parallel processing, the transformer method. As you can see, just one of these costs 32,000 pounds. And a row of these are all stacked together in the server farms, and then those rows are stacked together with more rows and all this kind of stuff. So there's something to be said about looking at the hardware, but also the economic dimension of like how these things are manufactured. What is that doing to, how did NVIDIA even end up here? So NVIDIA, for those who don't know, is like based in Southern California. And until basically the contemporary AI moment was mostly known for creating high-powered GPUs for video game processing on people's computers. So, this is a company that is now worth $2.5 trillion in terms of market capitalization. So we need to be paying attention to it as not just kind of, right place, right time, but like understanding how a company that makes GPUs is like probably, shaping all kinds of stuff. Again, go back to here. That's Keir Starmer with Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA, right? So there's these is having a lot of it's all quite important. Finally, I just want to end off with just we're working on our AI literacy toolkits, and the thing I'm kind of working on is just thinking about a political economy of AI toolkit, focusing on what is the political economy of AI, why it matters, who holds power, how AI systems are made, looking at power imbalances within the industry, talking about case studies, key terms, myth busting, things like that. And this is really like a general toolkit to think more in a kind of structural sense around what AI is and how it fits into our current political economic environment. Yeah, that's me. So I will speed the floor. And yeah, Elisa, if you want to come over here.
Thank you. So I'm gonna just start because this presentation is timed, so I don't have time to introduce myself. Visual AI is changing not only the images we see, but the very nature of vision itself. And these technologies are reshaping how we perceive, trust, and engage with visual culture in everyday life. They demand that we rethink vision, not as neutral reception, but as culturally and computationally constructed means. Like past visual revolution, photography, film, and digital media. This is an example. This picture that you see here is the picture that has been captured with a photo camera. AI-generated images brings new paradigm. But unlike this, it serves the link between image and reference, inviting us into a world of pure simulation. These signals move from representation to generation, from indexical capture to algorithmic systemic. The aerial gaze of drones was an early step in decentering human vision, offering perspectives once reserved for satellites. They initiated a shift towards mechanic ways of seeing. Drones made visible what had long remained beyond the human field of perception. Aerial images like this salt pond in Russia reveal patterns imperceptible from the ground. These visuals collapse the distinctions between representation and abstraction, reality and artifice, and they visualize complexity in ways that challenge both documentary conventions and aesthetic norms. Even a frozen lake begins to resemble a painting, reminding us that technology mediates not just what we see, but how we see. Drones thus become more than tools. They became agents of aesthetic transformation, and they invite us to see the world as it's made visible by machines. Scholars like Julia Hildebrand show how drones contribute to new research methods as well as visual grammars. Through their lenses, the aerial view becomes a site of interrogation, vision, power, and spatial imagination. And this perspective connects aesthetic with ethic, asking who controlled the gaze and from what purpose. Visual AI builds on this legacy by going beyond the camera, generating images that have a not physical referent. Here, the image is no longer captured by conjured, produced through data rather than light. This radical departure places us firmly in the realm of synthetic seeing. These AI systems draw from massive datasets, assembling images based on learned aesthetic cues. What emerges is a sensorial collage, culturally plausible, but yet ontologically unstable. And each image is an echo of others, shaped by the patterns and biased by archives it draws from. Take from the now famous image of Pope Francis in his puffer jacket. It spreads because it looked real enough. Its success wasn't in deception, but in how it mimicked existing styles of fashion editorial photography. The image worked not as documentation, but as a aesthetic familiarity made strange. Similarly, the AI-generated image of Trump arrest played into the expectations of media spectacle. Though entirely fabricated, it circulated as it documented a real event. Challenging our epistemic defenses, it demonstrated that narrative believability can override factual authenticity. This example reveals how AI imagery exploits familiar genres to gain credibility. In 2023, Will Smith's spaghetti video felt uncanny, exposing the awkward mechanism of videos of synthetic videos. Yet it marked the beginning of a new frontier of visual realism driven by generative models. Its strangeness revealed the early tension between artificial intention and human perception. 2 years later, Gould's video renders the same scenario with cinematic realism and emotional coherence. What once felt artificial now feels unsettling natural. AI visuals no longer signals their synthetic origin. They perform realism very convincingly. As AI visuals become more lifelike, they start to blend seamlessly with everyday media. The distinction between synthetic and authentic begins to erode under the weight of repetition. Visual noise becomes the new norm, blurring the boundaries between trust and illusion. In this new landscape, critical viewing becomes a necessary skill. AI literacy requires us to recognize how images are made and why they feel so convincing. We must ask ourselves, will viewers develop a visual intuition for AI, much like we learned to detect photoshopped images, or will this sophisticated AI aesthetics exceed our perceptual threshold entirely? The answers might determine our ability to navigate visual culture responsibly. As these styles proliferate, visual genres begin to collapse into one another. Fiction and documentary, amateur and professional, image and artwork all become interchangeable surface. Genre boundaries dissolve under the influence of synthetic visual language. These genre collapses demand new frameworks for understanding what images are doing rather than what they represent. The visual becomes less about indexicality and more about affect, circulation, and credibility. And we must shift from question of truth and questions of function and consequence. For a younger generation, growing up in this hybrid visual world, AI literacy must go beyond technical knowledge. It should cultivate ethical, cultural, interpretative skills to navigate synthetic realities. And education in this context must address how to make AI and how to see with it and against it. To conclude, we are entering in an era where visual trust is no longer assumed but must be actively verified, shifting the burden of proof from image to viewer and demanding new tools for verification alongside interpretative vigilance. In response to the disintegration of the indexical link between image and referent, visual literacy must evolve into algorithmic literacy, a critical practice that examines what images show, how they are constructed, circulated, and embedded into socio-technical systems. As visual AI technologies proliferate, this transformation calls for new ethical visual culture grounded in skepticism, semiotic analysis, and a reflexive understanding of the computational logics shaping our contemporary visual communication. Thank you. It was my first time to try a presentation that was going by itself. Let's take the standing up. Thanks. Okay, cool. Okay, hi everyone. I won't introduce myself again because I think I've introduced myself earlier today anyway, but just briefly, I'm Jessica Elias. And I wanted to sort of talk today, obviously, about sort of AI, but sort of build on that based on my work on digital semiology as a theory of power and harm in the digital context. And the way that I've developed this through sort of a user-centered focus of human-digital relations. And AI doesn't play a big role in the thesis that I've just finished, admittedly. It was sort of developing alongside as I was doing my research. So it has formed sort of a small section at the end where I sort of talk about where I want to take digital semiology in the future. So I thought I'd talk a bit about that here and sort of give more of my thoughts about this. So semiology as a theory is the study of harm, and the way that we typically talk about semiology is the study of social harms, so those that we can sort of empirically understand within the social realm. So as a sort of basic understanding, thinking about what does generative AI mean for harm production, we can see a lot of that within the social realm currently. We see that through political misinformation and disinformation that we are constantly sort of coming across, through the emotionally harmful content that generative AI models, LLMs, seemingly always sort of spit out, be that through, there's been lots of cases of Holocaust denial or the production of very emotionally harmful images to consumers as well, just through basic prompts from the models themselves, as well as through the reinforcing of harmful stereotypes and social inequalities. The way that generative AI, we can sort of see it exacerbating pre-existing social harms and social inequalities that have been around for a long time, but is producing and accelerating them at a much faster pace than before. But the way that I sort of take this is flipping that question on its head and thinking about what does harm production mean for generative AI? So what does it mean to think about a study of harm within the digital context, but specifically around these sorts of programs? As one of the main ways that I think about this through digital semiology, it's through the idea of corporate power, and especially big tech power and surveillance capitalism. So through this lens, what I see with generative AI programs, especially those that are consumer facing and free to access, is that we can see more and more data being exploited and commodified that users are sort of churning into the program, is then being used to train it and regurgitate it. That coincides with the sort of exploitation of our other personal data that is available on the internet, often without our awareness. And what that means for all of this is the furthering of those predictive capabilities of technologies that we see in the digital context. Those very sort of algorithmic structures that already structure our entire society and our entire digital sort of selves online are becoming more and more accurate in their predictions of our behavior, of our personal traits, our attributes and attitudes, and the way that they can steer our behavior. So the way that I see this with generative AI models is the next sort of level of that capability, the next sort of refinement of that process as that becomes more generative, other than, say, targeted advertisements or search engine queries. So when I think about human digital relations, I think about this in a few different ways. And the first one is that idea of sort of digital reliance and that seductive power of capitalism and the seductions of control. And the way that we see that anyway in the forfeiting of our personal data for our technological convenience. Classic example is Google with search engine queries and just how easy it is to access information. And how that sort of convenience is now such a commonplace thing that we all take advantage of all the time. And we see that a lot as well with generative AI. A lot of people are using them instead of search engines because it gives such a good summary of what you're looking for, and just how convenient that is and how seductive it is to keep us engaging with those programs. The main way that I sort of think about this as well when it comes to harm is through enforced digitality, that we're now in a context where our digitality is not optional. We can only disengage for a short amount of time from our digital apparatuses before we have to re-engage with them to be a successful member of society. There is no consistent opt-out button for us at all anymore. And as we see generative AI being introduced and sort of ingrained within basic technological and digital sort of infrastructures, the harder it is for us to then sort of escape those capabilities. And one of the main worrying things that I see when it comes to a harm approach is this idea of the cognitive offloading of our abilities through generative AI products, such as performing menial tasks, but also critical thinking, reading and writing skills.
And what happens to these abilities, especially in thinking about younger generations, if those exact abilities are not able to develop before we start introducing these programs. We've seen it over the years where just the introduction of like autopilot on commercial airlines has caused massive problems where pilots have then lost the ability to perform those tasks because they have quite literally lost the skills because it's been automated for them. And there's lots of different examples that keep coming out as we get neurological sort of convenience technologies that are now becoming more widespread. And that it is quite insidious thinking further into the future and for younger generations what these technologies might mean for those very, very critical skills. So thinking in terms of like my theory of digital harm, when it comes to the cognitive side of human digital relations, I think about this in sort of three key ways that then splits off in multiple different directions. And one of the key facets for me is the idea of self-relation, that being how we construct and express our identities and what sort of is informing those, but also this idea of epistemic harm in terms of knowledge habits and who holds that knowledge, who decides what is knowledge, and who is given knowledge holder status. And increasingly, especially through sort of generative AI products, we're seeing that becoming more and more in the hands of corporate entities with their own profit motivations. The second one is agency, and that in recognizing that digital technologies are imbued with their own positive agency, which is underpinned by a profit generation motive, and how that translates then into human behavior. As our behaviors are steered by our digital technologies, we increasingly internalize those exact structures. We start thinking of ourselves as our own traits and identifiers that are marketable. We are being told information about ourselves and how that impacts us. And lastly, and most importantly here, is autonomy. That idea of sort of individual freedoms as that pervasive hidden influence of digitality that impacts, impedes, and obstructs our autonomous human choices. And then lastly, you can't really see that that's in bold because of the background, but this idea of cognitive liberty, which is based on the work of Nita Farahani, which she talks in her book, The Battle for Your Brain, which talks a lot about those neurological technologies and the corporate entities that then possess and own the information, the neurological information about people who use those technologies, be it biometric healthcare, like a wristwatch, for example, or more nuanced technologies that are coming out, such as like skull caps that are used to monitor the sort of awakeness of long-haul truck drivers, for example. And that cognitive liberty speaks exactly to the threats to our autonomous cognition and the encroachments on our mental privacy that we are sort of now seeing increasingly. But one of the ways that I sort of see this talked about in popular online discourse that is a little bit entertaining, but I think is really sort of on the nose when it comes to young people talking about fears, especially around generative AI and this idea of undermining autonomy, is this phrase: why use brain when have chat? And this sort of justification for engaging with ChatGPT being like the key example that I see of why would I use my critical thinking skills when I can put a question into it and it can give me a perfectly referenced, seemingly, answer that I can supplant somewhere else. It informs my attitudes and beliefs, and I don't have to do the hard work of getting to know myself and building my own identity when I can just have it supplanted there for me. And I did try and make that sort of like the word art in old school, like Microsoft. Funny enough, the capabilities aren't there anymore. I was really upset this morning on the train, but the rainbow pattern does it for me. But yeah, why use brain when have chat? And I think it perfectly sort of surmises some of the fears that we're seeing when it comes to critical thinking skills and just thinking skills in general and sort of the offloading of those cognitive capabilities. So as a sort of summary then, I wanted to spin this idea of cognitive liberty and maybe transform that into some sort of cognitive literacy. And that I think as a phrase is really big and scary, and it's a lot to sort of start unpacking. But it goes along those lines of like cognitive liberty as the right to self-determination, recognizing that that is already being fundamentally undermined, but through generative programs, it can be done even more so, and especially with that profit motivation behind these corporate entities. And then there's the AI Mirror by Shannon Valor, which is another amazing book that I've used, where she talks about the AI capabilities that we see as being based on historical precedents of human data. There is nothing new that can come out of these products. And so we see a plateau of human creativity and potentially of critical thinking, of writing, as more and more is regurgitated, or as a really amazing article that I now can't remember the author by referred to the outputs of ChatGPT as bullshit. They aren't hallucinations, they aren't lies. There is no understanding of truth or knowledge within these. It is simply fabricating something, but it isn't lying because it doesn't understand that. But it's bullshit. In quote marks, it's quote marks, I promise. And then at the sort of third bullet point there, in terms of this idea of the infantilizing power of capitalism, that cognitive offloading for digital convenience it's a mechanism of control. And the infantilizing power of capitalism is from a book by Keith Hayward, by the way. It's not my source of own phrasing. But this very idea of sort of undermining those abilities, keeping us in sort of a placid consumption state, be that through online content or through products and knowledge, etc. So through all of this, I started thinking about cognitive literacy as this critical awareness of the impacts of cognitive offloading and the impediments of generative AI imposes to self-relation, agency, and autonomy. It's a big one to start unpacking. I think there's a lot more that I need to do in terms of thinking about that, but as an introduction sort of starting point, that is sort of where I had it. But I also wanted to end on a slightly lighter note, because I tend to be a bit doom and gloom when it comes to corporate entities. I'm a corporate abolitionist, just to put that out of the way. But I wanted to sort of bring this quote here from Emancipatory Technology Studies, where it says, "No technology, no matter how advanced, will simply liberate humanity, but hopefully the debate on future socio-technical arrangements offers a starting point for negotiating how we want to live in the future and what technologies could make a positive contribution." Thank you very much.
There you go.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me all right. Brilliant. So I'm Polina. I'm a researcher, PhD researcher in curating and architecture here at MMU. And today I'll be presenting one of my case studies titled Decoding AI, which I've done in collaboration with the Infrastructure Space Atelier at the Manchester School of Architecture earlier this year. So what was Decoding AI? It was a collaborative research project over 3 weeks, taking place part of an existing atelier. So an atelier is a group of students at the School of Architecture. I think there's about 6 or 7 of them in total. The atelier is mixed year, but we focus working with master students. And we wanted to explore, what does generative AI mean in practice for placemakers? We spent 3 weeks working with students, external collaborators, and then we had an exhibition at the end of that research. So why is it actually important to look at Gen AI in placemaking? Well, just because it's already out there in practice. Gen AI is being used in kind of more administrative sides of placemaking, such as internal systems using Copilot to summarize your internal manuals, to make them more searchable. The uses of AI to fill out forms, planning applications, internal documentation, which is really important in the field of architecture. But also, and I think which is even more kind of concerning, is the use of Gen AI as a tool for research, visualization, conceptualization, and also as a tool to support decision making. So what did the making of that project look like? And here you can see the different roles and the different colors, and I'll quickly try to explain it. So we have the pink color represents the academic background, the yellow color, the public sector, the blue color, the private sector in terms of placemaking and architecture. I put myself as a curator in grey because I just couldn't quite decide which color I should be. And the space and infrastructure space atelier has all 3 colors because of the permeability of the teaching process. So while it is an academic school, obviously there's a lot of practitioners, whether that's lecturers themselves or external guests that come in and influence the way that the course is taught. Generally speaking, the Decoding AI project was meant to be collaborative and co-produced and co-designed. So I worked with Richard Morton, who is also my supervisor, to design the project together for the infrastructure space atelier as a teaching process. But at the same time, we invited Sammy and Michael to represent different perspectives. And we had a guest speaker from the University of Porto. And as you can see, we had different roles allocated to us: some dreamer, the pragmatist, the technocentric. And that is a sort of simplification to make the project more doable, to represent maybe some of our opinions as well, and to kind of guide the process. And now, obviously, you might wonder, well, why is it important? Why should we do researching Gen AI in practice, in practical situations, context? Well, because it is a snake oil rich environment and people in practice are directly affected. We need to be able to communicate between the marketing apparatus of large AI corporations. We need to be able to see through the AI hype, and we need to also use language that's not just technical, that is very alienating to people who do not understand the backgrounds of coding. And we saw the opportunity of coming together and actually doing projects in trying to apply different range of questions around Gen AI in practice as a way to bypass those type of discourses. So the process was, so we had 3 days of atelier teaching. We had presentations, provocations, discussions. We asked the students to look through terms and conditions of Gen AI platforms in detail, and we had a shared large Excel spreadsheet around this. We questioned things around copyright and IP, really, really important architecture, very problematic if using Gen AI. We also discussed, obviously, biases, because when we design places, we need to be aware of what biases are present in the technology. Then we let the students develop their projects. We did an exhibition and a survey. And to just kind of illustrate a little bit what the presentations look like, we really wanted to make this engaging and interesting throughout, and make it also a critical space for, doubting the technology. So these are some images that presented in my first provocation, where I tried to compare the way that Gen AI is affecting placemaking to sort of transformation towards a factory bakery process, where places are being turned out in a kind of, with a sort of recipe, but obviously and sometimes they're good, we buy croissants from a supermarket, they're quite nice. But do we always just want the same type of result out of a process, a placemaking process? And just to illustrate that and go ahead with the bakery bread theme, I tried to do some visualizations of the high street and placemaking in Gen AI software. And the first attempt brought this beautiful bread house. But as we know, we don't really encounter that much of those kind of houses when we do placemaking in the UK. And to arrive to the 20th attempt, which looks more like a normal high street, I had to explicitly ask for bins and rubbish, different types of architecture. And the prompt was actually about 60 words long, and the system did refuse it a lot of the times, and I had to really refine it. So we can already see how detached those visualizations are from the reality of the high street, or just any street in the country. So I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'll quickly go through the results of our research in the exhibition. So those are student works that they've developed over those 3 weeks, so a very short amount of time. We had 4 groups of students working in groups of about 5 to 7 students at a time. This is one of the exhibition stations or areas that they've created, looking at bias. And you can see here there was an element of interactivity. But generally speaking, if I go to the next image, which I hope will load, yeah. So what the students did is they wanted to investigate bias in the image creation of using placemaking languages. So they used 4 different softwares, so 4 different Gen AI platforms that are located in different countries, 4 languages and 4 VPNs, and entered. So if you look, for example, this would be all the same prompt. This would be all the same language and VPN and software. And they entered the same prompt around, they translated the prompts in different languages, and you can see how the Gen AI interpreted the outcomes. And actually, the images aren't that good, but a very interesting outcome was this line here, where we asked for an accessible green space, and it looks pretty much identical, and all it did is to put a wheelchair into the park, which is a very limited definition of accessibility. And the empty spaces are the absences, so where the VPNs didn't work, where the language wasn't available. And it was a really, really interesting wall. I really recommend, we can share the slides afterwards, so you're welcome to look at it. Alongside, they kind of further worked on biases, tried to create maps based on the representations of the images. If we go back to the first, here you can see the maps. This size is changed based on their analysis of the images that were created. I wish I could go in more detail, but I'll skip that fast. A second work was exploring this idea of collaging. The group worked on an area of Whitehaven in Cumbria, so it's a small town in Whitehaven, tried to generate images, hit a wall because there's not many images of Whitehaven on the internet. A lot of them are very grim and grey or archival, so they had this kind of very grey basis of images, and they used a method to generate those, but yeah, once again, I don't have the time to explain. And then using those images, they invited the attendees to create their own collage to kind of rethink, well, how does the collaging process happen with Gen AI versus how do people collage images and connect things together? Very quickly, this station looked at the idea of control nets and trying to use the quiz machine to get back a prompt towards the building that you want to have. So this is the back end of it. You would choose an image and you try to retro-engineer the prompts behind it and see if you manage to guess what the outcome is. That was kind of trying to demystify the black box and understand the inner working of the process in a quiz format, which hoped to be engaging. And finally, the last part of the exhibition was mind versus machine, where the students trained an AI to use placemaking language by reusing placemaking documents, then put prompts into the AI, so which you could see on the left-hand side, and then invited people to take the same prompts and do drawings, and then compare the two. And I think this is a really interesting, so you have number 11 throughout with the path, and it's quite an interesting comparison. Some of them similar looking, but very different styles. Some of them are completely different. And that was just an exercise in trying to, try to analyze how do we think differently from machines, or how does the machine think different to us. Very quick note on, of course, this is very, very high in resource consumptions, the whole process. What we did from the start is we asked the students to document all their AI searches, image generations, video generations, or any other uses of AI. I then estimated, using recent literature and research, the impact of each search. Then we multiplied the searches by the kilowatts, hours, or by liters, and we had this outcome. And that's just from one group. And I do think it's significant to notice that, because we did use enough electricity to power around between 100 to 270 homes in the UK in one day. Yes, it is important to do research, but we need to be aware of what kind of impact that creates in real life. And again, multiply that by 4 for all the groups. But am I doing okay with time? Do you want me to? Okay. Very quickly, there was a survey, and I think it had some really interesting responses in the sense of they were very mixed, and that represents the field of architecture and placemaking. So to the question, do you think that an increase in the use of technology and AI will make places more inclusive for disadvantaged communities? 58%, which only a small majority said no. And on the scale from 1 to 5, how do you view an increase of AI in planning and placemaking? Again, quite neutral. A lot of people were distributed neutral positively, some were very negatively. And again, that represents the way that technology operates in the field. This is a brief summary of what we've achieved. So we've analyzed the complex topic in a short time. We work in an interdisciplinary way, collaborated between sectors. And we tried to empower students to be critical of AI. We communicated the research in an exhibition context, shared the resources we've created in the exhibition of industry partners, and investigated the process of collaboration, which is where my role comes in. So why do we need a curator when we do investigations of research projects? Well, I hope that the role of the curator can facilitate the collaborative process, help to create spaces for investigation, for reflection and criticality, and to guide the process in collaboration and in respect of our participants and their knowledges. And I want to highlight that the exhibition itself is not the outcome, but rather the durational process of knowledge creation is what the curatorial outcome is in this project. And as Paul O'Neill nicely explains, there is a need for making things appear by performing them, and thus configuring curatorial practices as part of an evolving, episodic, discursive, and perpetually unfolding collective network, which, in other words, the curator can help to create those spaces and to make those things that research and that collaboration unfold together. And I just want to acknowledge everyone who participated in the project. And of course, there's not ever a Gen AI project without the glitch. And this is a wonderful image of the Gen AI interpreting what placemaking means with quite a scary person walking something that looks like a toy pig, maybe. So that's all from me.
Hi everyone, I'm Susan O'Shea, Senior Lecturer in Sociology, and is everything working? Yeah. Oh yeah, nice. And I research everything to do with music, basically. So mostly from perspective of music movements, so social movements and activism contexts, in relation to community development and collaborations and relationships between musicians. So I've only started to think recently about AI because I'm also a musician and a performer, and it impacts the things that I do and how I approach what I do. So I've started to kind of try and figure out what it means, this opt-in or opt-out version of AI. And it touches on the conversation from earlier as well around creativity and copyright and some of those issues we alluded to earlier. But first, I want us to focus on the human story behind technology. And music has always been about connecting people. It's always been about the relationships between people, between a performer and audience, between innovation and tradition, between the individual and between the collective. So music has always been a really social act. And what does this mean? How is this called into question when we bring in AI into the center of that? So I'd also want us to think about music as beyond the creative industries, as beyond an economic value, because I think very often the discourses around the UK is about the music industry creating economic value at the expense of perhaps other things. So let us focus a little bit more on the social aspect of that today. I'm really interested in how music helps us make sense of our social worlds and how we build communities, and those communities can tell their stories through music. If we're thinking about the impact of AI on creators and how musicians' music may be training AI models without their consent, we're not just talking about copyright violations, but there's also the possibility of this kind of mass appropriation of cultures and types of music. And this is a really live issue. I was at a great conference in Finland just recently, and they were talking about that in relation to the popularization of yoiking in the Sami community and how that's monetized for people now. So AI plays a big role in how easy it is to do these things and to appropriate different styles into different cultures. So we're in an embedded paradox at the moment. AI tools are integrated into daily music practices. I think a lot of musicians don't even realize that they're using AI tools. It's embedded in our digital workstations. It's automating things. It's suggesting chord progressions. It makes things really easy to create a song very quickly. And the technology is advancing so fast. Just a few years ago, anything that was generated by AI was horrendous. It was really easy to spot it. It had trouble using vocals in particular and associating words with that. Now that has moved on a huge deal. So there's lots of tensions really within different music communities about whether we should embrace AI, and I'll say we in this context as a music producer as well, and whether we should embrace AI, whether we should reject it, or what that means for human creativity in a music context. So those tensions are real, but there's also lots of opportunities that come with that. So just to tie it in a little bit to cultural policy in the UK, We're at a crossroads, and I think just listening to the whatever it was called, not budget, but the budget review yesterday, there was talk about the creative industries being really important. Music is always the lost one in that discussion, but at the same time, funding is being taken away for the creative industries, and we're at a crisis in relation to learning music in school and people actually learning real instrumentations. So we're at a point in time that it's really important to make positive decisions. And there have been huge campaigning groups about this opt-in, opt-out model. And only yesterday, the data bill was passed, which basically cuts musicians out of the ability to opt out of large language models and training music databases. So that just went through yesterday, very disappointing. So we'll see what will happen in the next round and whether musicians gain back any kind of ownership over their creative art. Okay, so in relation to research projects that I'm embarking on at the moment, there's two kind of main areas where I'm looking at AI. The first one is under the title A Machine for a Muse, and that's with Lois MacDonald in Soda. And Lois is a practitioner, and she's created a really brilliant kind of AI-informed tool that is trained on her own voice to create various different kind of vocal experimental sounds with that, and she's moving to the next stage of performance, and then together we're looking at what that means in relation to audience interaction. So that's one of the projects. The other one then is in relation to the electronic music open mic movement with Kirsty Fife over here, and I'm part of that movement, and it's real live debate within that at the moment about whether people should use AI in performance spaces and whether they're using it in their tools. What does that mean? So we want to kind of formalize our knowledge around that and see what people are really doing in reality, what tools they're using, and what are the implications for them using those particular tools. Okay, so instead of stealing an image from the internet, I thought I'd do an AI image of Grimes. So that's an AI image of Grimes over there. And Grimes as a musician was kind of ahead of the curve. We won't mention the Musk connection. She was ahead of the curve in relation to AI development and how she would actually potentially monetize from that. So she was quite a pioneer in allowing, she developed a language model that kind of emulates her voice. So people are allowed to use her voice, her likeness, and to create music and tracks. It's all royalty free. She's not getting anything from that until they monetize something and it reaches a certain threshold, then she will claim back a certain percentage of that track if it's particularly popular. So that seems quite equitable and fair. However, I did experiment and I isolated my own voice and I put it into the emulator and I couldn't even share it with you. It was so diabolically awful. So I don't think there's that many people using it. She's a distinct kind of voice and it did sound very chipmunk-like. So I kind of passed on that one. The other one then is Holly Herndon. So that's Holly Plus, and she's kind of taken this relationship with AI a step further. So rather than it just being a tool, she uses AI as a collaborator, as a creative partner. And she's a computer musician by trade and a physicist and one of these polymaths. So she's highly technical. But she also has this open source system that fans can use, and they can upload their music through that and then have it modified with her models and then use it in their own production. So there's some interesting things happening in the creative spaces. But having said that, we need to keep in mind what's at stake. So what do we risk losing in this space? Well, we risk a culture of homogenization and a loss of tradition. So if we think if these AI models are being trained by the same things, they may start to neutralize things that they might perceive to be inaccuracies. So that might be atonal singing, it might be particular traditional types of tunes or folk music. It could then maybe decide it wants to create smoother patterns, and then maybe we have more homogenization. We may lose the social aspect, which is really, really important. And this is actually quite tragic at the moment. I'm being bombarded on Facebook by ads because they know what I like, and it's usually something to do with synthesizers. But this one is like, no band, no problem. You don't need a band to create music. You can bypass the band and just prompt. You don't even have to drop things in. You don't have to use samples. You just tell it what to do. And I had a listen, and it's scarily good. And that's what's really disappointing. Now, it's not my taste in music. It sounds like everything that's in the charts. I couldn't distinguish from what it created to what's being played on the radio, other than I know I don't like it. Well, it just means it's kind of gone to that level now. It's targeting people, create your masterpiece, but you don't even need other humans to do that. So yeah, so we might lose some of those traditional pathways of music creation as well if we're not careful. However, I kind of wanted to talk about music in the context of broader sonic literacies, because I'm using music as a kind of thing to focus on because we can all understand that, but actually it's really important to know what sounds are out in the world and how we actually can interpret whether they're AI generated or not. And there's huge implications for the deep fakes, not just from visual, but from audio, people's voices being mimicked, celebrity voices, but also perhaps our family members and being scanned and faked in relation to audio. And also we're at risk with biometric kind of security systems that use voice recognition, like voice recognition banking. If my voice can be cloned after maybe 3 or 4 seconds of somebody on one of those spam calls that are trying to get you to speak, maybe they're cloning your voice. So it's really important to talk about how we hear the world and how we interact with the world sonically as well. So that's kind of in the context of broader work that I'm doing around sonic ecosystems with my research group, Music and Sonic Studies. But I think having something like a map, a literacy map in relation to sonic literacies would be really useful. So you could have different pathways for those who are musicians and sound producers who have a different level of knowledge to audiences and fans. So making fans more aware that actually they're funding kind of war machinery if they're subscribing to Spotify and using their AI kind of generated playlists through there. We can kind of make decisions around how we support musicians in different ways if we have knowledge about that. So there's lots of different things that we could focus on in relation to sonic literacies. So I just want to say that we kind of have a choice about how our creative futures might look, particularly around sound and around music. We really should be thinking about future frameworks that should prioritize diversity and consent. And we do know that the models that are trained are very homogenous. Musicians and sound artists can shape AI's creative role. They do have a role to play, but we all have a role in protecting music's human essence.
Hello, so I'm Matt. I'm a philosophy academic specializing, at least previously, in the work of Martin Heidegger, a 20th century German philosopher with contributions to phenomenology, existentialism, and the philosophy of technology. And my interest in artificial intelligence, and in particular LLM chatbots, comes out of that specialism. Put in broad specialist terms, what that means is I'm coming from existential philosophy and hermeneutic phenomenology. However, I don't really expect anyone to know what either of those technical terms means. So let's talk through those briefly. So taking existentialism, which I think is the one you've got the most chance of having heard of before, this is, I'm trying to sort of narrow these down into like one claim each, but the central claim of existentialism would be that the human must not be understood as a mere thing, but as a dynamic being that can never be fully grasped by its physical state in any particular moment. This is often expressed as human beings being futural, their minds always being in the future, and that not just being an accident or they're just imagining what they're doing, but we are actually stretched out through time, for example. So you can never really narrow it down to our physical facticity, as they would call it. Phenomenology, if that's got a central claim, is that the nature of any being, whether human or object or artificial, the nature of it, what it is in a sort of a fundamental sense, should be manifest in our lived experience of it, rather than through more abstract metaphysical reason. That's more of a philosophical point about let's look at our experience itself rather than trying to construct abstract explanations of things. And then finally, the point of hermeneutics would be that our interpretation of lived experience is always informed by historical ideas. And an example of that is the term lived experience itself, which, as I'm sure you will probably hear it several times a week now, it's on the one hand quite important in lots of talk about personal experience and epistemic justice, but it is also corporate jargon that is used a lot to try and talk about something ineffable. But that is a specialist term that came from the phenomenological tradition. It was invented by phenomenologists, and it has filtered down. And one of the claims of hermeneutic phenomenology, which is specifically really just Heidegger and his followers, is that metaphysical ideas, philosophy is not confined to textbooks. Those ideas escape and filter into our general culture, into common sense and our subconscious ways of understanding things. Now, from that, that's sort of my general worldview, for want of a better word. This is what I sort of instinctively think about AI, and I probably should have said LLM chatbots, but I mean, I'm really talking about the chatbots, but it could go for it in general. Since we know, because of that point about existentialism, humans should not be treated as mere things, because we know that AI is a mere thing, that LLM chatbots are mere things, they are sort of software on hardware, all this physicality, then it cannot be of the same nature as a human being, which is one way of expressing the anxiety about, wow, can it think like us? Is it sentient in a more vague sense? But it can't be like us. That would be my initial assumption. Phenomenologically, the idea that my lived experience of something should tell me what its nature is, that tells me that it should be kind of, maybe not obvious, but discoverable in my experience of it. And yet, what I want to talk about today is that's not very clear. Hermeneutically, I would say all conceptions of AI will be metaphysically loaded. For example, the discussion about is it really thinking usually comes down in very Cartesian terms, i.e. within the framework given by René Descartes about sentience and self-consciousness and so forth. The way that we think about these things is going to involve that tradition of metaphysical thinking that's not always appropriate. Now, I do think that all of these statements are true about AI. I think it is a mechanical device. It cannot be human-like. I think this should be evident in our lived experience of it and so forth. But as Adam was saying before, AI is weird. And I think that weirdness could also be expressed in another phenomenological term. It is uncanny. Although we also talk about the uncanny valley, which I think is very appropriate to it. Now, AI in all its forms is weird, but I'm focusing on the LLM-based chatbots. They're extremely weird because when they're working well, they feel like people. And the way that manifests in my lived experiences, I feel like I have to be really polite. I think of it, I have to correct myself to call it it. I think of it as a him. I think of ChatGPT as a him. Oh, I asked chatters yesterday about this. I might even say to my partner, I think of them as a person I know. I comport myself around them entirely as a person I know who is kind of helpful, knows a lot, sometimes makes things up, is a little bit toxic, to be honest. But I can't deny that I'm at least pretending that it's real, which seems to cause a challenge for that sort of second point about phenomenology. My lived experiences seems to be telling me that it's not quite a thing, because I have to think of it as a person with proper personhood in order to engage with it at all. By which I mean, you know, in order to collaborate with it, I have to be polite, to use personal pronouns in my mind. I let down my guard, which I think is a really important risk for harm. I mean, for this project, I didn't really use it at all until about 6 months ago, and I've been using it nearly every day since then. My carbon footprint must be just utterly terrible, but I need to understand it. And I can't even begin to think what it knows about me now, that I don't even know about me, what it can construct about me. But, so in order to utilize this tool, I have to at least pretend that the ChatGPT is like a person, or at least that they use language, have intentions, and experience time, which I would usually preserve for humans and most animals that we would tend to interact with. Otherwise, I can't use the prompts at all. And that's not just a technical requirement. I have to adopt a certain way of being with the technology as though it is talking to a human being. And I think that's a fundamental issue. These capacities cannot belong to an entity that's a mere thing, according to me, at least. This means that I have a contradiction between how I act when I use it and my own philosophical convictions. Now, this, I think, is more broadly known and frequently spoken about with less philosophical baggage as the problem of anthropomorphizing AI or LLMs in particular. And there are plenty of people from all sides talking about how that's something we shouldn't be doing already. There's a lot of assumptions there. But one thing I want to do in this project, which I'm at the beginning of, is to fully explore the reasons why even engineers who we would think would have the surest knowledge, understanding that it's not human, still do this. And there are papers that I'm sure those of you looking at have seen. There was one a couple of days ago from Apple, where we can see that anthropomorphizing in the way that the people working on this technology is causing problems for its development. Now, this can only be done, I'm running out of time, so I'll run through this a little bit quicker, by exploring the inverse problem, which I don't know if I'm using this word right, I just looked it up, mechanomorphizing as well, which is not just the thinking about AI as like a human being, but thinking about the human being as like an AI or like a machine, which I think is another thing that crops up, maybe less with experts, but certainly with lay discourse and popular discourse about it. For example, a few weeks ago, Elon Barenholtz released a Substack entitled "You Are an LLM, Deal with It," which I think he definitely believes it. It wasn't really an argument, it was an assertion. This isn't an insult, it was a poem. It was really rhetorically brilliant at asserting that claim. But there's no reasons to assume that, but we do it a lot throughout history. Humans like to use these pieces of technologies and devices to interpret themselves as not being that dynamic thing. I was talking about Heidegger, who I did my PhD on, speaks about how he talks about reading newspapers and so forth as a way in which we reduce our singularity, try and escape who we really are as this, vibrant being, because the most fundamental experience of that vibrant being is that we're all going to die because we are mortal and we have anxiety about that and we don't like to think about it. So that's one thing I want to look at as well. And I'll just finish by sort of saying what I'm going to be trying to do. I want to investigate why both anthropomorphizing and mechanomorphizing in relation to LLMs is so compelling. Like, it's not just people being stupid. There is something about it that makes it almost habitual, let's fall into it. And in the end, I'd like to provide something like a phenomenological account of AI, or at least LLMs that avoids the traps of that I've kind of been talking about. I also want to delve into the canon of theories and key texts that have informed the prime developers of these technologies, as these remain the dominant context in which the AI is developed and spoken about in general. And in short, take that AI is weird experience and really try and unpack what's going on philosophically. Why is it so weird? Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much, everyone. I think we used up our time.
Yeah, we're out of time.
So we need to go for a break so we can catch up on some breath and some energy. So those of you who are online will be back in 20 minutes for the keynote. Those of you in the room, thank you so much, and we'll resume in 20 minutes.
So, thank you.